Okay, so just to invite you, those who haven't yet, just to introduce yourselves in the chat, please. I'm Shirley Walters, president of PIMA, but also more importantly, a member of our organizing group in the Climate Justice and Education group of PIMA. Welcome to the first of the two teach-ins towards a pluriverse of possibilities: unlearning, separation, relearning, relationality. I'm based in Cape Town, hence 7 p.m. at night. These teach-ins are part of the PIMA Climate Justice and Education events that we've been running over the last more than 3 years. And we've co-hosted them with a number of other adult education networks, CASI, the Canadian Association for Studies in Adult Education, and Tim is with us. And Tim, thank you so much for your help. Really appreciate it. Moja Africa Network, Scutria, based in the UK, and Adult Learning Australia. And so we've worked together over the last, as I say, over 3 years, trying to, in fact, encourage this cross-regional conversations about climate justice education. These teach-ins follow the PIMA bulletin that we published in January this year, and you can find that on the PIMA website, where we focused on re-envisioning relations between the humans and more than human world. And Elizabeth Lange, who is our lead this evening and for these two sessions, has also published something in that bulletin. We really are delighted to welcome Elizabeth Lange, who's tuning in from Vancouver Island, whose life work, I think, is captured in her latest remarkable book, Transformative Sustainability Education, Reimagining Our Future. Many people, and I'm sure most of you, have known for decades, and for some for centuries, that humans are disrupting life on Earth. The critical question is, how do we do things differently? And Elizabeth's remarkable book addresses this question. She is addressing the big questions of our time, and the book deserves to be engaged by all of us who understand the very existence of the planet is in peril. She writes in an imaginative, storytelling manner, being true to her commitment to relational ways of being. It is this storytelling, relational way of being, that we can look forward to today and in the next teach-in on the 5th of October. I do hope that you got the message that you are invited to have an A4 piece of paper and a number of colored crayons or pens that you will be asked to use during the course of this session. But before handing over to Elizabeth, just a few housekeeping matters. As I've said, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Mute unless you're talking. We will be recording sessions, and they'll be made available to you. And we'll post these on the PIMA website, and the addresses in the chat. And it might be helpful to listen to those recordings between this session and the one on the 5th. Colette February and Leslie Cordy are very kindly offering their technical assistance for us. So please direct message them if you have any any technical issues. The proceedings will be captured, and thanks to Shauna for putting her hand up for doing that. And they'll be in the next PIMA bulletin. And when you want to speak, if you can just raise your hand. Also, just to remind you, if you have any resources that come to mind related to this conversation tonight, if you wouldn't mind just popping those into the chat as well to share with others. And we need to remember that we're not all first language English speakers. And so if we can speak clearly, slowly, and if there is a problem, if you can just raise your hand if you need something to be repeated. But with that, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Elizabeth Lange to lead us.
Can you see the slide?
Can do.
Okay, awesome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you, Shirley, for such a lovely introduction. I'm very honored to be here and humbled by so many of you and your interest in being here. And I'd like to give thanks to Shirley and Astrid, Colette, and Leslie and Tim for all of their hard work, really, in making this opportunity happen today. So today we're going to talk about toward a pluriverse of possibilities and the first step in unlearning separation and relearning relationality. You can see that I've just switched the slide. That's working.
Yes, it is.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. So this is one of two connected workshops. In this first, what I'd like to do is just share some of my core ideas about the history of the West, relearning kinship ethics as part of relationality. And second, in the second workshop, then after a couple of experiential activities in between them, we'll be talking about composting the more problematic ideas of modernity, again, as a way to unlearn separation and relearn interrelationality. These ideas are all based on my book, as Shirley has mentioned. So I need to be true to where I live, and as part of the decolonial practice and a practice of reconciliation here in Canada, I wish to acknowledge that I am a settler of Germanic origins. I grew up on the land of the Plains Cree, with whom I have close associations, and some of who are my teachers. But now, as Shirley mentioned, I live and speak to you from the land of the Coast Salish on Vancouver Island in the Pacific Ocean. And I give thanks to all my Indigenous brothers and sisters who are my teachers, my friends, and my colleagues, as every day we try to find good ways to move forward together. And every place, of course, is dealing with their colonial history in different ways. So I'd like to broaden this greeting this morning, this acknowledgement, to an earth greeting as part of a gratitude practice. At more formal gatherings, Indigenous communities would do this in a much more extended way. And I try to start each of my days with such a gratitude practice. So let's just create a minute of quietness. I'm lighting a candle. And this is to acknowledge earth, water, air, and fire, and the fact that each of these elements works with the others to permit life on this planet. I would also like to give thanks to the sun this morning for his warmth and the light of his fire, to the moon for her cycles that enable growth, the movement of the ocean waters as tides, the movement of water in plants and even in our bodies. I'd like to give thanks to the ocean, the mysterious womb from which all life has come, and also to all the land bases on Earth, which provide a home for us and countless other beings. Let's give thanks for the vitality, the abundance, and the intricacy of these Earth systems and all the living beings that help keep us embodied ones alive. I would also like to acknowledge that it is new moon today, and it's a very propitious time to talk about a new time in human history, as well as to begin something new if you wish to work according to the cycles of moon energy. So what are we going to do today? I'd like to just take a few minutes to name the moment, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a few minutes, and then to talk about really the old story of modernity and some of the more fundamental ideas, but problematic ideas and practices that have really informed this whole historical time. And then I would like to move into some of the emerging new stories, which at this moment are being called relationality. and then to offer two practices to you. One is a breathwork practice as a way of stepping towards relationality, and then to talk a little bit about kinship ethics. And then we're going to do a kinship mapping exercise. And then from that, we'll move into some group dialogue to talk about some of your insights. And then we'll come back together as a plenary and we'll share some of those insights. And then I have two activities I'd like to invite you to engage in before we come to the next workshop. So this one will have more ideas at the beginning, and the next one will be much more based on dialogue from some of the experiences that you have in the meantime. So that's what we're up to over these next two workshops. So let's move into naming the moment. One of our important tasks really as educators and scholars is this task of naming. And this moment in time has been called the Great Epochal Shift by many scholars. Some say that the shift is as profound as the Copernican revolution, when we move from the Ptolemaic story of the planets revolving around the Earth and shifted to the heliocentric story where the planets revolve around the sun. The shift in this story and other stories is what really enabled European society to leave behind the feudal era and begin shaping the modern era. But now I think many of us realize we're in the dying days of modernity. The past 10,000 years has been called the Holocene period. It's a geological period in which the Earth's environment has been unusually stable. And yet, over the last several hundred years, human activities have really been pushing the living systems of the planet outside of their safe and stable operating zone. And this graphic here by Rockstrom and 28 of his colleagues originally, and has been carried forth by others, the green zone is the safe operating zone. But we've been pushing it out past that, which is the orange areas. So what are the 9 planetary boundaries that regulate the living conditions to maintain life on the planet? The first one is climate change, where global warming now is at 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And of course, we're inching closer to 1.5. And after that, then of course, changes are going to compound and speed up, although we've already seen that. And we know that we're heading for quite a chaotic future. The second boundary is biodiversity loss, where many species now are declining. And this has been called the 6th extinction and has really been considered the largest loss of life since the dinosaurs. The third is the land use changes, mainly converting wildland into agriculture. The fourth one is use of fresh water in ways that's actually changing the water cycle. The fifth is biochemical flows. Primarily, they're looking at nitrogen and phosphorus from fertilizers, which are polluting air and water. The sixth is ocean acidification. Of course, as the carbon is absorbed by the ocean, it's now changing the ocean chemistry. And the seventh, aerosol particles in the atmosphere, which is now changing the water cycles and cloud formation. 8 is ozone depletion, which we actually reversed since the Montreal Protocol in 1987. And 9, the introduction of human-made materials or novel entities such as plastic. So we know that we've soared past 5 of these 9 boundaries. And so if you want to know more about this or you want to teach around it, I would really recommend David Attenborough's video, Breaking Boundaries, is really excellent for teaching purposes. So it's clear really that 8 billion of us doing many of the same kinds of activities, using many of the same kinds of products, we've become a biophysical force that's really changing the context of life on Earth. So now what we're entering into is called the Anthropocene. It's an epochal shift, really, that is a shift in the composition and the operation of the planet. So we know that this decade, from 2020 to 2030, has been called the decisive decade of these planetary deadlines. If we do not pull our activities back within Earth's regulatory capacity, we know the life base on which we depend is going to continue to die. And just one of these tipping points is climate change, now considered at code red. The fierce and unprecedented fires, most notably here in Canada in the Arctic, which is really frightening, as well as all the fierce storms and flooding and earthquakes and other extreme weather events, even that have just been happening in the last few days. These are increasingly dangerous. But we also know that we have international agreements that are addressing this. So the first one, of course, is to try to meet net zero carbon by 2040, preferably, although the outer limit is 2050. And there's another one that addresses the sixth extinction, known as 30 times 30 by 2030, which is placing 30% of the planet's land and its waters under protection by 2030. So we know that there is lots of activity happening. These initiatives are crucial to ameliorate the damage and avoid the worst impacts of overshooting these boundaries. And many, many educators, I'm sure most of you, are working on this as part of the global movement toward a sustainable and regenerative future. It's important that people understand these boundaries, these challenges, and the rapidly decreasing window for change. As well as the goals and the actions that are required to reach these goals. And I'm working municipally as well in my own little place, trying to ensure that our community is moving towards these goals. And so while this work is urgent and crucial, these realities actually call for something far more fundamental if we're going to leave behind the patterns that have been creating really this long emergency that's been accumulating over centuries. So what I'd like to do is really talk about where we've been as the West and offer a very whirlwind tour in the history of the West and the development of modernity and its core ideas and its composition in terms of the practices. So if we go back 20,000 years, in the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras, according to Riane Eisler and many others, it was a time of small agriculture and egalitarian communities who respected a mother goddess or a female principle. But according to Eisler, these were overtaken by horse-riding pastoralists and warrior nomads, and they brought the ideas of stratification, of hierarchy, of war, a male god, male rule, and heroism, and values like heroism, to name some of the cultural shifts that we now call patriarchy. Then we move into the classical empires. We have the Greek and the Roman empires, and then the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically a Christian empire. And at this time, extensive use of militarism and imperialism, as well as the desire for conformity through invasion and subordination of other peoples. Then quickly we move on to the Renaissance, and we have the development of ideas of humanism, individualism, and dualism, and these comprise some of the ideas of early modernism. Then moving forward, the scientific revolution, the scientific method initially developed by Francis Bacon, was really considered as providing freedom from Earth's shackles based on the belief in human dominion. The Earth was really considered dead matter and ultimately reconstructible. And our ideas of knowledge were about seeking certainty, using rationality and universal secular reason. But as Edgar Morin suggests, really it was very narrow knowledge, whatever could be explored utilizing the scientific method. Anything outside of that was extraneous, and it also displaced many, many other ways of knowing. Scientific discoveries gave us a cosmology where the universe operates like a clock. And of course, we began to rely on new technology, which yielded really a machine view of life. So for instance, we even treat our body as a machine. And over the past few hundred years, other species were considered biological machines with no sentience or even a feeling of pain. Then we move into the age of colonial empires, where colonialism was understood as a civilizing endeavor, but now we see it really as a spread of violence and death. It was the collision with and destruction of other worldviews. It involved genocide and slavery and trafficking of many people. It was the rapacious use of land and resources, much of which is still continuing. And ecocides. I mean, the beginning of all the extinctions really started in the 1700s, and I cover some of that in the book. There's other books that also recount this. The Nutmeg's Curse and Dark Emu are just two of them. And then we know that knowledge was stolen if it was useful, or it was erased if it was considered not useful. And of course, we know this is still happening today as well. Then we move into the Age of Revolution. From the Enlightenment comes three revolutions, the French Revolution, American Revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution, leading to, of course, capitalist industrialism, which is based on the ideas of property ownership, extractivism, reliance on technology for attaining efficiencies, reconstructing everything from societies to people and their bodies to things. And of course, this whole system required mobility, uprooting people so that they could go in search of jobs. And of course, this whole constellation of ideas has all been portrayed as progress, of which is unlimited. No limits are put on where progress can go and what it can do. Then, of course, the idea of a nation state develops, and this is considered civilization, and it includes ideas like representative democracy, liberal human rights, ideology, and the nation as an economic entity, and of course, then the rise of the middle class during this time. And then, of course, the late modernism in the 20th century with constant crises, 2 world wars, ongoing depressions and recessions, the environmental crisis starting recognized in the 1970s, social justice and civil rights crises also starting in the 60s, climate crisis as what we know now. And yet what's so remarkable really about this whole system is the hiddenness of the violence behind corporate and bureaucratic structures. And so the whole name modern really comes from the Latin word modo, meaning that the priority is the now. It really has been a lack of regard for the past, for ancestors, for the spirit world, and for posterity. Vanessa Andreotti says that this is the house that modernity built. Andreotti also says that modernity is not an object, and it actually is not even an era. She calls it a living entity with an energy that drives it. So what is that? There's a whole belief system that really provides the energy behind modernity. And so we know every day we know these ideas because they inform our daily lives. And this includes progress, success, efficiencies, power as control. We know it's individual autonomy, competing with others, being as efficient as we can, and even our bodily movements as well as our work. It's comfort, seeking comfort, order around us. It's striving for achievement and winning. It's understanding affluence as even fabulous wealth through money and consumption, and that is what's going to get us happiness. And yet we know these beliefs are actually based on our lowest human qualities, our fears. It preys on our fears. It taps our greed, our arrogance, and our desire for power over other people. And we know we're part of a rat race. This whole busyness, that we have to strive and run and be on the hamster wheel for survival is as necessary for meeting our needs. And of course, it shapes our desires and our fantasy for fabulous wealth and fame, while building on our fear of scarcity, that some things are going to run out, some things are not going to be available. And now in the last few decades, the rage, hatred, and revenge industries, which are being really fanned by the global elites for expanding their control. Because as they weaken society through these ideas and this division, at some point we're going to be looking for strong leaders. And of course, the last three ideas within these qualities is human exceptionalism, where we feel we're superior as a species. It's our anthropocentrism, which we consider ourselves as the center of all things. And then our individual entitlement. And every day we hear ads, I deserve this, or I am worth these certain things. So this is the whole constellation of ideas and practices that have really comprised modernity. So what's been its impact? Well, we know that modernity has deeply conditioned our thinking and the way even we organize knowledge, even in universities and schools. It's conditioned our values in all these different ways. It's conditioned our way of being and even our imagination. It's really limited our imagination. And every day it shapes our behaviors and the way we work. And it even has shaped the way we feel and the way that we relate with others. It's penetrated really our cells, our minds, our bodies. And it's really at this deep level that change needs to be made. And so what we need to do is start to withdraw our energy from this whole system and all the different facets of it, and redirect our energy and repattern ourselves to create something new that will enable us to survive and thrive past this chaotic time. In sum, modernity really is about separation. And different authors call it different things. Some call it ruptures, some call it denials, some call it alienations. But there are multiple separations from the body, from emotion, from our wisdom and our creativity, and our higher qualities. It's a separation from each other and skillful ways of being in community. It's separation from a creative and an active cosmos. It's separation from the living world and a very complex understanding of our place. And many, many scholars now are engaging in a deep questioning of the very fundamentals of modernity. And even the earth herself is talking back to us through all of the extreme weather, COVID and other illnesses, the movement of species now into new territories. These are just some of her messages. So we're in a transition moment. This epochal shift is this transition moment where a deep transformation is required. A transformation of one part of the transformation being in worldview. And so these are some of the stories that have progressively made modernity. But now we're in between stories, moving into this zone where the old is dying, but the new is not yet really known. It's not really named, but we know we're moving into a different kind of reality. And so as part of this now, there are some new collective stories emerging. So what are they? Well, Newton and Galileo saw the universe really as a large clock where everything moves mechanically, including all the planets. Individual stars and galaxies were seen as floating in black empty space, like the image on the top left. But now, with new photos from the Hubble and James Webb telescopes, we see now the material that actually is connecting the stars and the galaxies, which is the image on the lower left. This is changing the whole science story. It shows us now that the foundation of the universe are actually dense webs of energy pathways connecting all things, called the cosmic web. As NASA explains, each bright knot is an entire galaxy, and then the purple filaments, which you can see, are the energy that connects these galaxies. We have come now really to understand, we have understood reality is comprised of atoms as the fundamental building blocks. But now with Einstein and all the quantum physicists since then, we see that particles can show up both as energy or matter or both. And so we now see reality as a highly sensitive web through which vibrations of energy are constantly pulsing and transmitting information. And like the image on the top right, a superfine net where all of these lines and knots are floating and constantly moving, so that one thing is constantly impacting all other things in the cosmos instantaneously. So this is the science view of relationality. Science has studied the earth in separate disciplines for hundreds of years, and we've always reduced things down to their component parts and then examined their functions to understand an organism or a physical reality. But the new story now, when we look at the earth, we see her as a whole, as in this Earthrise photo from Apollo 8 in 1968. Science is now becoming an instrument for the recovery of the wholeness of the universe. And we now look for patterns and systems instead of component parts and functions. Closer to Earth, we see her now as networked systems. All living beings and processes are linked, impacting each other synergistically. All of these systems are self-organizing and they're self-regulating to maintain the optimal conditions of life to exist. So these four primary systems are the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the geosphere. And they're all working together in an organic process of self-creation. And so the earth tells us through these systems where it's healthy and where it's ill. And we can learn to more humbly cooperate within these natural rhythms and processes. There's also a new story of human consciousness emerging. The old story was that humans are self-contained in their bodies and minds. In the story of individualism, we're individuals each pursuing our own good, our own freedoms, and our own entitlements, really responsible only to ourselves, at least in the last several hundred years. But the new story is that we are nested eyes or communal individuals, profoundly related to everything around us. Our body boundaries are actually perforated with mineral and chemical elements moving in and out, an energy web that flows within and out our bodies. We are actually made of all the same elements as the universe. The living systems within our body are nested within a social system, which is nested within an earth system, which is nested within a whole cosmic system, and energy is pulsing through all of that. So just like a spider's web, any little movement on the web is relayed immediately throughout the whole web. So this leads us really to a new understanding of learning as well. In the old story, only humans learn. Four-leggeds and other animals don't have that capacity, although behaviorism told us that they have some limited learning capacity through reward and punishment processes. But in the new story, every cell in every living being uses perception and cognition to maintain a state of health. As Christian de Quincey says, consciousness goes all the way down. Therefore, cognition is the process of life. All of life learns as they live. This is why we are now, so many now are talking about the sentience of plants and animals and living systems like forests. They're cognitive systems and they're responsive to us, and we need to be respectfully responsive back. So learning then in this view is really about responding to the intelligibility of the world around us, something I'm going to ask you to experiment with over the next few weeks. Another implication is energy fields. And this is fascinating. Scientists have now found we have 3 brain centers in our bodies. The largest brain, of course, in our head. But there's also one in your gut, which we have always called intuition, and there is one in your heart. The heart is approximately 40,000 neural cells similar to the brain. And these neural cells actually make up 60 to 65% of the heart. So it's a powerful center for receiving and processing information. Electrically, the heart is 100,000 times stronger than the brain, acting like the sun around which our body revolves. The heart actually sends more messages to the brain than vice versa. The heart also generates a large, powerful electromagnetic field around your body, and it extends from 6 to 8 feet from our body. So those around us can feel the power of our energetic field, and we can direct our energy. We know that. We can direct our anger energy, or we can direct compassion energy. Groups of beings also have an energy field, and it can be coherent and therefore very and in sync and quite powerful, or it can be incoherent, out of sync, and therefore weak. And that can apply to a partnership of two people, to a family, to a community, or even a classroom of learners. Forests, too, especially in the place where I live, where big trees exist, forests have an energy field as well. Certain kinds of forests have different chemical and energetic compositions, which is why the Japanese talk about Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, as a healing mechanism. The state of our heart also affects all our other organs, including the chemicals, the hormones, and our immune system. So really practicing joy, compassion, and gratitude can actually help physically heal us. And so next time I'm going to teach you a heart-centered breathing exercise for this. Finally, then, we have a new human story that's beginning to develop. It's the world spiritualities, who have each developed their own stories about the origin of the universe from their perspective, the origin of humans, and the role of humans on Earth. Each of them has offered teachings, or what Indigenous people call original instructions for how to live. These developed in specific places as a relationship between the land, the place, the people, and the spirit world that they heard speak there. And so while we find personal meaning in specific traditions, they are all part of the larger human story, each with their own truth. And so Indigenous people talk about all of these stories are simultaneously true. We also know that this new human story, is part of it, is a revaluing the importance of wisdom, as well as the use of story and music and poetry and art as important forms of knowing that can help manifest higher human qualities. As educators, then, our great work, as Thomas Berry defines it, is when we connect our work to the fate of the human species, when we connect our work to the history and dynamics of the earth and the cosmos. And so we can engage our educational work toward healing from modernity and toward a very new life-giving way of being. We can midwife the great transformation. So I want to end my comments here and just ask you to take a few minutes to write some of your responses into the chat to some of these stories, the old stories and the new stories, and any questions that you may have. I may not have time to answer them all in this session, but I certainly will attempt to do so between this and the next session. So let's just take a couple of minutes at this point as a little break, and for you to pop some ideas and insights and questions into the chat.
We see a few messages coming in. Keep posting your questions and thoughts into the chat.
Okay, that's wonderful. Keep them coming. That's exactly what I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do over this and the next session. I think it was Shauna that asked, what about some practices? So let's move into doing a couple of practices, actually. Wonderful. Absolutely excellent questions. Thank you very, very much. Okay, so let's do a practice that will sort of address part of what you're asking here. Where do we begin in unpicking modernity and all these notions of separation? As educators, of course, we know we spend most of our days in our head. One of my newly graduated PhD students was asking me some questions a little while ago, and I responded to her, well, what does your body say? And she answered, I have no idea. I've been so much in my head for so long, I can't even feel my body. And this is definitely one of the perils of how we teach. So let's begin in the body. Embodiment practices such as breath work are just one step to relationality. Embodied practices such as this can be considered micro-activism, micro-resistance, because we're enacting an awareness of and a bodily resistance to, as well as a composting of modern stories that we carry in our body and our thinking. Breathing often seems way too mundane to matter. Yet because many of us live in a really stress-driven society, we only breathe from the upper part of our lungs and our shoulders, chest breathing. So when we actually deepen our breathing, we actually create a spaciousness, and we can actually slow time, which moves against modernity's understanding of time. And we can create this when we have a gentle pause between breathing in and breathing out. So I'm going to invite you to try some belly breathing. So I'd like you to get into a really comfortable position, upright if you're in a chair, and we're going to use belly breathing because for as little as just even 5 minutes a day, it can really bring calm and focus. It can still the mind and help you become aware of the constant stream of emotions and thoughts that keep us so occupied. And it's the first step to changing unhealthy patterns and for evolving humanity. And in learning spaces, we can use breathing exercises with learners to help clear their minds and create more of an open receptivity, leaving everything else at the door. Learners are much more able through this kind of exercise to tap their natural curiosity, their desire to live, and then they can move into a flow state or a state of full engagement and concentration. And sometimes attention will actually drop into the place of interoception, which is the eighth sense where you become aware of all your other senses. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to ask you just to sit up straight if you are. If you want to lay down on the floor, you feel free to do that as well. Try to have your feet flat on the floor if you can, as if you're sort of planted in the earth. Sometimes it's helpful to even stomp your feet for a few seconds just to get the blood flowing, and then place your hands very loosely in your lap and just rest easily. And when you're settled, just gently close your eyes. Begin by taking a long, deep breath in. You should be breathing deep into your diaphragm, not just the usual shallow chest breathing. And as you breathe out, start relaxing the muscles of your face and relax your belly muscles. For the next deep breath, put your hand on your abdomen so that you can actually feel it expand with your breath, blowing up like a balloon. Then exhale all the way out, drawing it out, letting your abdomen deflate. You should feel your belly relax. So breathe again, letting your belly rise like a balloon, filling with air, and then deflating naturally. The lungs and your rib cage should remain quiet. As we rarely breathe this deeply in modern society, we can feel discomfort at the beginning because we're fully engaging the diaphragm, which is the air pump for our body. So just notice any physical feelings as they arise. By the end, you will likely notice both your body and your mind has calmed. Now I'd like to invite you to do 10 more long, deep belly breaths. As you breathe, I'm going to offer a short reflection on our matrix of life. Our breathing is the first step in moving from a sense of separation, even the separation from our own bodies, towards being in relation with all that is. Through breath work, we re-enchant the universe by becoming reacquainted with the vital spark that pulses through all life. Our breath links our bodies to all that has existed and that currently exists. Each breath includes molecules from the stars. In this way, we are part of the cosmos. Our need for oxygen is absolute. Oxygen is our matrix of life. Therefore, each breath is an essential ritual. It is the creation of oxygen that enabled the whole explosion of life on planet Earth. We breathe in parts of all that has gone before us, from the dinosaurs to volcanoes, to all the humans that have preceded us. We are indebted to the forests that create the oxygen upon which we depend. They breathe in the carbon dioxide that we expel. We are also connected to the oceans and water bodies through the water vapor in our breath. Through our breath, we are connected and porous to all things. From our very first cry to our last sigh at death. So breathe in deeply. In breathing, we contribute to the possibility of life after us. Philosopher Christian de Quincey writes, "Our only hope is to reinvigorate the language of the body. Learn to let our muscles, sinews, blood, and bones sing again in beautiful harmony with the wild chorus of the land, the sea, and air. To feel again the pulse of natural kinship. We need to open the vital channels between our worlds, even our written words, and in our bodies with the articulate flesh of the world. This is one beautiful pathway forward to a life-giving way of being." When you're ready to come back from this moment of quietness, you can slowly just wiggle your fingers, and then your toes. When you're ready, just come back into the room and open your eyes. So through our breathing, we've come to beginning a sense of being connected, understanding our bodies, our thoughts, our heart energy as part of relationality. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking with you about relationality as kinship. And I'm going to pull from my Cree teachers who use the word wahotoan, which means all my relations, or we are all related. And in some cases, they will say to you, wahotoan meaning, so who are you? And typically you would answer by naming your family lineage and your community of origin. And some of you may actually know this or remember it, where people had a complicated map, family and community relations in their heads. And so often the greeting means all my relations greet all of your relations that you carry with you. And I know this is common. The Lakota Sioux here in North America, the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, the Mohawk all have similar words. So I'd like to ask you if there are similar words where you are. If you know of one, I'd like you to offer it in the chat. And if you don't know one, in the next few weeks, I'd like to invite you to see if you can find one, a similar word that means that we are all related. What's interesting about Indigenous languages is that they're verb languages, meaning it's the act of being in relationing. And it recognizes really the animacy of the world. So when they talk about a bay as a body of water, it's not a noun and it's not a static thing. It's actually, when they use the word bay, it means a body of water actively being held by the shores around it. And so that is an ongoing relationship. And so in English, words like emotioning, or even my kids always use the word adulting, is one of the ways that we begin to shift language towards animacy, languaging animacy. So kinship does not mean having relations. It means we are our relations. We are born into a certain family, social relations, an ancestral lineage, a historical reality, and into different biotic and cultural relations. We are inherently related as we grow in the womb and at birth. We are merged with our own little body. Perhaps we're placed on our mother's body, touched hopefully gently by relatives and friends. Air and water touch our bodies and penetrate for the first time. And so even when we're first born, we are born into relations. We have someone who hopefully mothers and fathers us. We become a son or a daughter who acts, reacts, and relates from within all of these relations. So even before we develop language or a sense of separate self as a child, this whole matrix of relations we're embedded in, and it constitutes who we are. So we're not self-contained. As Karen Barad says, we are performed into being through these relations. But for Indigenous people, being related is not just family and it's not just ancestral. All my relations includes the trees, the standing ones, the birds, the winged ones, the insects, the crawling ones, or the web weavers, the fish, the finned ones, the animals, the four-leggeds, the medicine, food, and other plants, as well as the planets and the elements, the thunder beings, the four winds, the sun father, the grandmother moon, and the stars. So they would know you by the land that constitutes yourselves. So you're not only embedded in your relations, you in the natural world are kin. The earth gifts you every day with what you need for your sustenance. And so our responsibility then is to honor this and offer our gratitude. And as Robin Wall Kimmerer says, you would never refer to your grandmother as it. No living being should be called an it either, whether it's a river, a mountain, or the earth. So you'll see that I've been actually referring to different things as he or she, because all of these elements are kin. And so ethics is inherent already. It's already present. It's not something that we choose and then enact. We are enacting it in every movement, every action, every word. And so respect, reciprocity, and responsibility are needed for living in harmony with all things. So let's do a slightly different, thank you for all the beautiful words that you're putting into the chat. I want to build on some of these in the future. I'd like you to pull out your piece of paper now and your pencils and perhaps pens, whatever you may have. And let's just do a very short practice or activity called mapping your kinship relations. Honestly, I think this activity, we're going to do it just in 5 minutes, but it could take a whole course to explore this at a really deep level. But part of our task is to reclaim what it means to belong to a land. So we belong to a land. The land does not belong to us, as we often think in property ownership terms. And so a land can claim us. It doesn't necessarily have to be where we're born or where our ancestors are from. So learning to think and live in this way relationally is how we become life-giving people. And so we can foster sustainable societies at a really deep level this way. So a good place to start is to map maybe the land where you were born, or a place that you remember that's very special to you, either as a child or later on in your life. So if you can get your piece of paper and your pens out, and I'm just going to ask you to use lines and stick figures, but you can of course develop this much further and enhance it later. And in fact, you may need to actually do a little bit of research in order to complete it. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is draw the key landforms and any major water bodies. And then does where you live or this particular place have a bioregional name? So you can see in the very center of my drawing here, I was born and raised in Edmonton and lived there for 55 some years. Just south is where all my grandparents settled, Ellerslie, Wetaskiwin, Millet, and Pigeon Lake. And you'll notice just in sort of the yellow area, that bioregion is called the Aspen Parkland. Then I'd like to ask you to put a marker for your home and other familiar and special places. So south of Edmonton is Calgary, and that's where the South Saskatchewan River flows. The North Saskatchewan, I've noted, flows through Edmonton, and that is where my drinking water has come from. So I want you to mark then where your drinking water comes from, your main regional foodstuffs, and any other key industries. So where I was born here in Alberta, it, of course, in the 1940s became an oil producing area. So I've got some oil rigs in there. And then in the very top are the tar sands at Fort McMurray. And then I'm like to ask you to put in the birds that greet you every day or did in this place, and the familiar trees and plants. So for instance, north of Edmonton is all northern boreal forest. South, of course, is the Aspen Parkland. And then down further in the province is the tallgrass prairie. So these are the three bioregions. And the buffalo, of course, used to roam this whole area, but that now much of it has become ranching land and is the source of a big beef industry. There's also the dairy industry, and I've put in here a magpie and a raven. And of course, the edge of the province is the Rocky Mountains and the Continental Divide. And just on the flip side of that, of course, is where we used to get all of our fruit. So can you take just 5 minutes, maybe a little more, tell me if you need a little more time, and just do a very quick drawing like this of a special place to you. If you have any questions as well, just pop those into the chat and I'll answer them as they come up. And we're going to use this map in a few minutes for our discussion. Okay, just a few more moments. Okay, so we're going to use this as a way to introduce ourselves to one or two other people. And so I'm just going to give you a little demonstration of how I might introduce myself. So often we introduce ourselves to other people by our profession, or how long we've lived in a place, that kind of thing, how long we've been there, how long we've been with an institution, or so on and so forth. So here's how I would introduce myself using my kinship relations. I'm Elizabeth Lange. I am the water of the Columbia ice fields, which comes from the Rocky Mountain glaciers and runs in my veins. I am the oxygen of the boreal forest, which inflates my lungs. I am the minerals of the #1 soils, the beautiful, some of the best soils in the world that suffuse the vegetables my mothers and my grandmothers grew in their gardens. I'm connected to the land that still remembers the drumming of the buffalo hooves, which populates my night dreams sometimes. And the ecosystem is the Aspen Parkland, and so the whispering of aspen leaves in the wind, it still vibrates my cells. So this is just a little sample of how I would introduce myself using my kinship relations. And of course, this is just a very small example of our kinship relations. So let me give you just a couple more examples, and then we'll move into our group work. This example here is from Norval Morrisseau, who is really understood as the Picasso of the North, and he began the Woodland School of Art here in Canada. And kinship as identity is really a core theme in his art. He was Ojibwe Anishinaabe, And he became known by illustrating the relational nature of all things. So if you look at all the elements and beings in this particular piece of artwork, they're all connected by lines, and those are lines of power. So he shows how all things are connected and the energy flows from humans to other natural elements, trees and animals and so forth. Their identity is in the lake-studded area of Northern Ontario, where rivers are the key movement corridors, and canoe was the primary means of transport. So he shows this life-giving relation then between the water, the loons, the fish, the land, the moose, the wolves, the butterflies, and is trying to illustrate that they're all sacred. He actually was a shaman. And so he painted in a way to evoke a vibrational field, because he felt that his art was both teaching and healing by illustrating how all living things are in constant transformation. The next example is an Inuit one by Kanjuak Ashigak. She's from Baffin Island in the Arctic Ocean. And of course, the predominant color is white, which is in the background, which is the snow, of course. And it shows her figure in her parka, completely embedded in the living world of the short-eared owl, the Arctic char fish, diving ducks or plovers, the sandhill cranes, and the Arctic cotton grass, which they used to use for candle wicks. So through her beautiful artwork, she shows the spirit that's behind all things, and how life moves by the rhythm of these different seasons. But you can see how it kind of all intersects at the center, that all of these are different faces of the sacred. So I'd like to invite you now to, and the people who are doing the tech for us will divide you into groups, either pairs or triads. And I'd like each person to give an introduction to yourself using this kinship map that you just drew. So let's take 5 minutes each to do that. So that's 10 minutes. And then I'd like you to spend the next 10 minutes discussing the next 2 questions. So does this way of describing yourself actually foster a shift in perception? And how can you stay mindful of Wohotwin, or all your relations, and all the other beautiful words that you've offered here? How can we stay mindful of these each day? And the next question then is, how does this move us towards a pluriverse, where we recognize that each person carries this whole system of kin relations? So I invite you now into your small groups, and we'll come back with some insights, and we'll address a few questions before we close today.
Okay, I'm going to open up all the rooms, and you'll be automatically assigned of groups of 2 or 3.
And can we put the questions in the chat as well for people to refer to?
Oops. I will go ahead and try to broadcast each one of the questions into the rooms.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, it seems like everybody's back. I'm sorry, you're probably feeling frustrated because you didn't have enough time to finish your activity. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask you for some feedback so far, and then we'll send you back for question number 3. Is that all right? So the first question is really just some insights that you gathered, some comments on the activity. How was that for you? So if you want to speak, just raise your hand, please, and then unmute and you can speak. Just a comment on how this activity, how did it work for you? Introducing yourselves in this way.
I can add some comments.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking in our little group just about kind of as humans existing in different places, not necessarily in the place we were born, but an activity like this kind of allows us to think about all those places that we've been and what we have seen and what was around our area, and kind of relate to the commonalities that we found. Like for one person, it was the sea that they connected to in all of the spaces that they lived. For others, it was the animals or plants or something like that. So it was just really nice to be able to have a little bit of time to think about things that have stood out in your life, and kind of how where I guess your kin was developed as you've moved through life in that way.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jess. Anyone else who wants to comment, please? Unmute and speak.
Hi,
Yeah.
Eddie here. We were in a group of two, so we had a good amount of time to share our reflections. And what we had in common was thinking back to sort of childhood memories of things that we took for granted as children and maybe reflected on later in life. But smells, the smell of the particular vegetation. You know, we were I was talking about Corsica and London, and Shirley was talking about South Africa, and but also water. That the sense that a lot of the water sort of infrastructure is often very hidden, but at certain times it becomes visible, whether it's through irrigation, whether it's through collecting drinking water, whether it's because of a drought or a water crisis. But just that sense that as a child you don't necessarily think about water as being important. It's just there, and it's when you reflect on it, you realize that it's part of a system, and that the weather, the rain, the rivers, the streams, the springs, the drinking water, the irrigation channels, and I was remembering, the disputes in the village. We were a village of smallholders and farmers, and very small farmers, and the people would be constantly opening and shutting irrigation channels that you could see the water flowing, and they would very, very jealously guard their access to water. It was, and although it was plentiful, it was still very jealously guarded, and a source of potential conflict. And I, as a Londoner, this is in a village in Corsica, but when I went back to London, water was just the thing that you got when you turned the tap on, and you didn't really reflect on where it came from or what the infrastructure was. So and trees. We also talked a bit about trees and the relationship with trees.
Thank you, Eddie. How was the activity? I mean, how did you find yourself relating differently because you had introduced yourself in this way? Did it open new pathways to conversations or to relations?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, sorry, I don't want to speak again necessarily, but yeah, I thought it was a very nice, very good way to start a discussion, and it was a new way to find commonality with someone you didn't know.
Good, thank you. Did anybody get to question number 2? A shift in perception. How you can stay mindful of all your relations, of your kinships each day. Anybody get to that? A conversation about that?
I'll jump in. We just started at the very end. We had 54 seconds. Speaking of capitalism. Anyway, and yeah, we started to explore that, how it was actually took, you really had to do some thinking. You had to shift. Usually in introductions, we say, what we do. So this was like this was more shifting to, okay, what are you made of? Like, as a being in the world, and being relation. So it was, it's good. Like, it's just, but it was hard.
Okay. Thanks, Shona. Anyone else?
We didn't get to question number 2, but we did start talking about shifts that are happening as we're describing our experiences. So I don't know if that counts at all, but that really got me thinking as we were talking about clean water. We were talking about, so I come from the Yukon originally, how water tastes when I go back to the Yukon, and I never realized that it actually has a taste. Now I realize, of course, now that I go back, and every time it's just amazing. So for both of us to realize that that is such a rare thing just is a shift in itself. And then talking about air, clean air, finding clean air becoming even rarer in places that normally has clean air, such as, again, the Yukon, because of climate change and the fires that we're experiencing in Canada. So there was already shifting and thinking happening without getting to question number 2.
Okay. No, of course, they're all related and linked. And I think we're not really, well, I'm not anticipating that you had much time to discuss number 3, but I think we've got about 15 minutes or 10 minutes left, and I'm wondering whether you want to go back into your groups or whether we should stay in plenary for question number 3.
Stay in plenary, I think.
Stay in plenary, okay.
Yeah.
So how does this introduction, how does this focus on kin, on relationality, how does this move us towards a pluriverse, where we recognize and accept the kin relations each person carries, but maybe it's not just the person, but also the world around us? So how can this move us towards a pluriverse? So I'm thinking about, the responses that you gave and saying similar smells or very different smells of home place, the taste of water in different places. So that already suggests in some ways a pluriverse, doesn't it? We have different worlds that we come from, although the essential substance, water, air, may be the same. So is this a tool for moving towards a pluriverse, and if so, how?
Julie has raised her hand.
Okay, Charlotte.
I was thinking that by describing oneself in this way, you open up the possibilities of understanding where people are coming from and where you might find similarities or differences. And in that way, you can then imagine alternatives, because I think it kind of opens possibilities for different conversations and different kinds of imaginings of where and how one might live together. So yeah, for me, it's like an opener, but I haven't necessarily thought about where it would take me, but I can see it opening the possibilities for more exploration, I think.
Thanks, Shirley. Other views? You can just unmute it and speak if you'd like.
I think for me it showed the entanglement of all beings that I grew up with. Like, yeah, in our group, Carolina noticed that we all grew the places we grew up in, and I think that was interesting that we looked at all the things that influenced us in growing up and becoming part of the person that we are now. And those exercises made this more visible for me, and maybe gave me therefore also a sense of more gratitude for the place that I come from, or a better understanding of why it's so important for me and why I drew this, because there's so many beings that influenced me and that I guess co-raised me. Like the forest was a big part, and I spent so much time in the forest as a child, and this exercise gave me an explanation for why this time in the forest still feels so important, because I guess the trees were part of raising me and a part of me still.
Thanks.
Beautiful.
I guess,
sorry.
I guess for me, the question about the pluriverse is how does it relate to the systems that shape our relations, our social and economic relations with each other, with other humans, which are not entirely not shaped by us and are kind of imposed on us. And I was thinking a lot about my childhood in this exercise, but in fact, the world of work, and living in capitalism, all the social relations and economic relations you're engaging in are part of systems which are in many ways not shaped by the natural environment. In fact, they're based on destruction and exploitation of the natural environment and people. And so, in a sense, the exercise of getting back in touch with your kinship with the natural world jars with the reality of your social and economic relations in the, I don't want to say real world, but in under capitalism, basically in the system that we live. And I wonder how it helps. Does that exercise help us to take some control, to do something about the harmful relations that we find ourselves in a system that we can shape a little bit, but essentially it's beyond any of us as individuals to shape. We have to shape it as, we have to shape it collectively. So that's a bit garbled, but I suppose I'm thinking here about social relations and human relations rather than those with the natural world.
But it was interesting to me that, in the feedback and most of you gave, you were talking about trees or forests or waterways rather than yourselves. So if we think about the introduction to this activity, it was all about, I am so-and-so and this is where I work and I'm a very important person. And now we're just saying, actually, I grew up with trees, or I grew up next to the sea, or, for me, whatever, the meadows and the flowers are very important. And so immediately we're talking about a totally different kind of relationship in a different kind of world, not the world of hierarchies and consumers relations. Yeah.
I wonder though if I could come in, Eddie. I related to a little bit about what you said, because we talked about how this was a bit discomforting at times too, like when we are thinking about our kin and the world. Like for me, for instance, I grew up in a town with 2 rivers running through it. One of the rivers was dammed to bring power to California. So there was a sense that I really relate to this river because I swam in it. It was our drinking water, like all of that kind of stuff. But on the other end of that as well, it was used for capitalism, for making money for the economy. So I think maybe this practice, this activity is a tool to maybe allow us to confront a little bit of discomfort that we might feel when we think about this, when we are trying to balance that, the I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I hope it makes some kind of sense, but balance that feeling where there is a little bit of discomfort because we all kind of exist in these structures, but then we can relate to the more natural world that also helped us grow. Yeah,
thank you. Joe, you had your hand raised.
Yes, Daniel and I had an interesting conversation because it was very polarized, because Daniel had been brought up, I think in Scandinavia, where there was lots of storks out in the wild, and because the area became industrialized, the storks all left. But I don't know what's happening. What he's saying now is that they're now trying to encourage the stalks to come back because of environmental issues. So there's work going on there. But my experience was totally different, because I was brought up in a rural industrial town in northeast England, and I lived a street away from the cooling towers of the steel industry and the surrounding coal mining fields. Okay. Now, the thing is that there wasn't a tree or a shrub or a flower in sight. Basically, you had lots of rows of, streets, for workers to live in, because you were totally dependent on the steelworks. The communities were built round the industries. And then, obviously, what happened was that you had the whole of the deindustrialization of that area in 1980 to 1985 that actually resulted in the fact that you had no work, you had the total fragmentation of kinship, which had been very strong, and also that you had enemy emerging into the area. The communities were fragmented, and I won't go into all of that, but basically, as a child, I actually had no access to the countryside. We had no cars. There was no transport system out into the countryside. And the nearest place to actually see anything that was green was in a park, which was about probably a half a mile away from where I actually lived. So basically, what I was saying to Daniel was, I put this garden, this is my garden here, and I fiercely protect my garden because I've worked for it all of my life, and I protect it, and I won't let anyone touch it, simply because now people are buying up the land here, okay? The houses here as people die or go into care. And they're knocking down these beautiful little cottages and houses that are now that have been surrounded in land, okay, and have lovely gardens. And they're building, these great big footballer wives' houses all around us. I've got 3 on the other side of the trees. I've got 1 next door. And so I'm holding on to this because I didn't have it as a child. I just never had it as a child. And it's so important to me. It's very important to me.
Thank you, Jo. Grace has had her hand up for a while.
Yeah, I've come a bit far from my original thought, but I'm going to try to roll it back. This is more responding to what Eddie mentioned about kind of the dissonance between this practice and the social systems we find ourselves in. There's a theory of change that really resonates with me that's very present because I just included it in my dissertation. Which, by the way, a few of you are cited in, so it's cool to be sharing space. But it's kind of a theory of change through the cracks, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But and there's many people who have inspired my understanding of this: Catherine Walsh, John Holloway. But it's kind of this idea of creating disruptions from your position where you find yourself in the system. So, for example, I think this practice understanding of identity is a crack, because suddenly we're not following the normalized identifications of I'm a student, I'm an educator. I am those things, but I'm also the water of the Chesapeake Bay. I'm also someone who grew up with birch trees, and it creates this disruption the same way that when you refer to a tree as they or he or she instead of it creates a disruption that then has the possibility to expand and disrupt in other places. And so I think that's one beautiful and simple and real way that this does contribute to a pluriverse, because we are creating these possibilities for new worlds to emerge and to spread through our everyday actions from wherever we find ourselves. I'll keep it short because I know it's that time. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for keeping it short. I think you wrapped it up very beautifully. I couldn't do a better job. I think the disruption that can be caused by introducing ourselves via a third, if you want, and a reference to something that's supposedly broken, and we're reminding ourselves and making a reconnection, and then making a reconnection with somebody else's connection to, and I think that is in itself, yes, it can create that beginning of a pluriverse. So thank you very much for participating in this conversation. I know we could carry on for quite a long time, but we have run out of time. So I'm handing over to Beth for final bits, and then it's back to Shirley. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. What a beautiful discussion. And Grace, you did a beautiful summary that this is exactly by conceiving things differently. Excuse me, we do create these cracks. That's exactly, and that dissonance, that's exactly where we need to go. And that's what I'm going to ask you to carry on over the next few weeks. Just excuse me for a minute. Okay, so, and some of you have asked, more about confronting and dealing with separation and so on and so forth. So what I want to ask you to do now until we meet again October 5th is to really start noticing these myths of separation around you. Awareness and naming them is the first step. So I want you to think about, as you go through, your daily life, the notion of dominion and control, the notion of ownership, the notion of success, progress, consumption, certainty, order, autonomy, and so forth. So all of these ideas which totally inform modernity, I want you to look for them everywhere, everything that happens around you. How is this separation manifesting in daily ways? And then I want you to think about, and so if you can record these, that would be really, really helpful. And then what is the impact, when you're going through a grocery checkout or, parking your car or whatever? How is separation embedded in that movement, in that maybe in a conversation, maybe in, how your body is moving? Just really try to probe how separation is informing that and shaping that. So again, order, certainty, ownership, success, progress, consumption, dominion, all of that. And human exceptionalism. How do you see those myths around you every day? And the second thing now, to counteract that, a bit of an antidote, if you will, is to go and find what is called a sit spot. So a place where you can just sit, that's in a natural area. I mean, it can be a backyard if you wish, but it's better if it's a wildish area. And you simply go and find a place to sit. It can be on the ground, but it doesn't have to be if you're on a park bench or something like that. But please sit there for at least 20 minutes to 40 minutes. And what I'd like you to do is use all of your senses. Notice everything around you. Now, the reason we ask for 40 minutes is because it takes 40 minutes for the natural world to return to its activities after you've interrupted it by moving into it. So that's why 20 is kind of minimum, because that enables you to settle. It allows you to get your senses operating again. And then you just sit and be open and let the area befriend you and let it teach you. And start to identify, what are you being taught by all the little ones that are moving through there, through the plants and so forth. And this has multiple layers of richness, this activity. So again, if you can find a sit spot somewhere that you feel, and do it at least twice, find a sit spot where you feel comfortable, but it's a little bit of a wild area so that there's natural things happening there. It's not a heavily manicured area. And you sit for 20 to 40 minutes. Again, your senses are important, and stilling yourself, so you can use your breathing if you want, just to still yourself and kind of sink into that place. And then just watch it. And watch the ground immediately around you. If you want, you can keep your focus just very tight around you, or you can actually watch everything that's happening around you. It's up to you, because we can use a micro focus or a macro focus here, and let it teach you. And then if you can please come with some stories about both of those things. And so we'll really go much more deeper. And so here's my assumption I'm working on, that with different sensory input, it changes our neural patterning, which changes the way we perceive the world, which begins to change our belief systems, which begins to change our behavior. And this is transformation. So that's what we're trying to do. And so if you can do it in a way then that you can replicate with your own learners, then we're beginning to find that pathway into a more relational and life-giving way of being. So I look forward to being with you next time on October 5th. Thank you so much for being with me and working with some of these ideas and activities today.
And a round of applause for Beth. Thanks so much. Thank you so much. It was really a wonderful session. And looking forward to the 5th of October when we will be continuing. I want to just really express deep thanks to Astrid, to Colette, to Leslie for helping today, and also to the different networks of Kasai, Moja, Skutria, and ALA, who have actually helped us also set this up. So the next session is Composting Modernity. Thank you for your participation. And we will be posting the recording on the PIMA website. And so you can always go back and re-listen, think about it, and so on. So thank you all so much. Have a good day, evening, morning, wherever you are. And we look forward to seeing you again quite soon.
Thank you.